Hello. I'm going to have a drink first. It's only water. Should be wine. Give better lectures if you're an artist with wine. If you're a mathematician, it's not so good. Well, I am very, very, very happy to be here. And especially in connection with the Prado Museum, which for me is one of the great sources of inspiration for my work. And I want to thank the friends of the museum for inviting me to come and talk to you. The first time I cried as an adult in an art museum was here at the Prado, 1983. And I have a lot more to say about tears and art a little bit later in my talk. But tonight I want to talk to you about something that I find to be the essential point when discussing art. And of course tonight I'm going to be discussing art not from the point of view of an art historian, but from the point of view of a practicing artist. And the thing that I think is the most important thing about art of all kinds, from all cultures, from all places on earth, is the fact that in works of art we have the traces of the self that is latent in all the things that human beings make. A kind of spark of life, a connecting thread, and a living presence in these material objects. And I think this spark is especially present in my medium, the medium that I use, video, because video speaks in the language of sparks. So I want to start tonight with the thing that I know best, an image. And I want to show you a video that I made most recently, actually, in the last year. It's called Fire Woman, and it's a part of a larger sequence of works I made for the 19th century opera by Richard Wagner called Tristan and Isolde. And I did video projections for that opera, a new version of the opera by director Peter Sellers. And so let me show you a little bit of this work. I have a lot to share with you tonight. So let's take a look at Fire Woman, please. Because we don't have much time tonight, I'm going to suggest that we continue watching this. We're going to lower the sound, and I'll continue talking because our time together is very precious. We can keep the sound up just a little bit, please, so we can hear it. So a little more? That's good. You're seeing something strange happen here when what you think is real, in fact, you discover becomes a reflection and not the reality, which I think happens all the time in our lives. And that's an image in the mind of a dying man, Tristan, who's waiting for his love to come to him. And of course, she never arrives, he dies. So again, I'm very, very happy and excited that the Prado is doing this lecture series involving contemporary art. And I'm really happy as an artist because in my field of art, the only way to get into a museum like the Prado is to be dead for a couple of 100 years. So I'm very happy I'm alive and connected with the Prado. I want to say also that it's a very, very important time historically for this connection to be happening. And it's not just happening here in Madrid. The Getty Museum in Los Angeles, another large historical art museum, has now announced they are making permanent video galleries for media art in the main halls of the museum. That's a very important development. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has started collecting video art. My piece, the Quintet of Remembrance, is the first piece of media art to go in their collection in 2002. So for me, it's not coincidental that all of this is occurring in the digital age. You know, places like the Art Institute of Chicago, National Gallery of Art in London, the Hermitage in Russia have all showed media art and continue to do so. But it's very clear, I think, to all of us that we are in the midst of an incredible, extraordinary technological revolution. It has its roots in the late 19th, early 20th century, but it is taking off now full force and affecting all of us. Information in the electronic digital world is moving at the speed of light. It is based on the most fundamental state of human decisions and discernment. That is the binary choice. That's the root of the digital system, is a yes or a no, like a baby. Yes, no. A 1 or a 0. Young people growing up today in the age of computer and internet see no boundaries between time and space, as has been conventionally understood. For the current generation and even for us older pre-internet, pre-cell phone people, time and space as we know it has been drastically, radically transformed by these new tools. Right now, everything is accessible to us instantaneously, anytime, anywhere, in some great eternal now, which is a kind of technological Buddhist paradise. And all those little separate boxes of knowledge we had that we inherited from the Enlightenment have now been broken open. Boundaries and borders dissolve. All surfaces are porous. All walls are transparent. And I believe that in this new landscape we're in, together, powered, driven by the image, it is not a radical or revolutionary concept that the work of contemporary artists should be brought into close proximity with the art of the past. I believe it is a historical necessity. It makes no sense to a young person to have these kind of divisions that we've set up already to separate those kinds of things. And the essence of it, again, getting back to the practice of art, is not only the works of art can transcend time. We can go into the Prado, we can look at an image from 500 years ago, from a culture we do not understand, we don't really know all the details of, and yet we can be touched and moved. That's a miracle. That's a miracle. So what I think is going on actually is it's creativity itself, the act of creation, which is behind all of those works, is the true universal language that links all of these objects made by human beings, these special objects we call art objects. It links them all in all cultures, in all places, and at all points in the timeline of history. So what does all this mean in practical terms, what I'm saying? Well, I can only speak from my own experience. And my path as an artist has been obviously not only affected, but actually empowered and created by this technological revolution. So unlike many of my colleagues in the areas of painting and sculpture, the path that I took as a video artist was inverted. It was the opposite of the common path that contemporary artists take as they develop their work. What I'm saying is basically I presented my work in museums first, and then later, at the age of 42 years old, had my first show in a commercial gallery. Normally that's backwards. Normally painters, sculptors, artists showed with galleries where all of the cutting-edge experimental work was, and gradually, over many years, were able to show in museums. And even beyond that, that showed already the kind of connection to the public, to the general public, that video created. As soon as people saw video, they were excited by the image, because it was speaking to them in a contemporary language. And the second thing is that, which is quite ironic also, is by the time I was 30 years old, probably about 1 million people had seen my work on television, where my videos were being shown around the world then, and that was looking at it right in their own homes, then had seen my work in museums up until that time. So that was really, has taught me a lot about what it means to make art outside of this, at times, rarefied world of contemporary art, of fine art. That's not a historical continuum. That's a very specific condition we have in the modern world of this special place for art in these special halls called museums. It didn't always exist like that for human beings. But my experience showing in museums made me think about a lot of things as a young man. I thought about how we look at art. Why was I showing my work and seeing my work in these sterile, clean, white-walled spaces, isolated from what was going on the street, what was going on out in the real world? Why were these spaces so different from the old churches and the temples and the shrines that I was seeing on my travels, that were cluttered and a little dirty and a little chaotic and sometimes noisy? I began to think also about history, of course, being in a museum. Because I never made video with the thought of it was going to be collected in an art museum. I was just interested in the image and making art. So here I was in these halls of some of the great paintings by many of the artists I had studied in art school, and I was in the next room now with my work. It was exciting, but I was also thinking a lot about what that means and what's the nature of time. Will my work exist in 200 years? And what about preservation? How do we preserve this stuff? How do things continue to remain with us? And then finally, I thought a lot about tradition, about lineage, about a path in history continuously developing, of which, when I stepped into a museum, I realized that I was a part of. Even though when I was young and starting out, I had no interest whatsoever in art history. Everything looked old. All I cared about was the new stuff, the latest thing. So my ideas started to change in several ways. One of the first things I realized, the first thing I had to get rid of, was my concept of the old masters. When I became seriously interested in Western art history, when I was in my early 30s, after rejecting it for most of my younger days, I started looking at the Italian Renaissance, and I thought I should really take another look at that after my art history class had really destroyed it for me. No, actually, I got a lot out of my art history class. I had a good teacher, but I just wasn't connected with this work. Most of it was religious, Western art. I didn't relate to that as a young person. But I was really thrilled to discover, after starting to do my own research, that all of these so-called old masters were in fact young radicals. They were avant-garde artists. Most of them that we know were in their 20s when they made their breakthroughs. Masaccio was 26 years old when he painted the Trinità in Santa Maria Novella in Florence, the first public painting created with the new system of perspective. Michelangelo was 24 years old when he sculpted the Pietà, a masterpiece in marble unprecedented by any artist, in St. Peter's in Rome. These were not minor places these guys were working in. These were the major centers of power, political, social, spiritual power that they were working in. Raphael was 25 years old when he did the fresco cycle in the Stanza della Segnatura in the Vatican in Rome. So these guys were young artists with radical new ideas, working with the latest concepts and technologies. These were new ideas coming out of research institutes in places like Padua. The latest thing, the computer, internet, World Wide Web, digital design, that's what they were doing. And it was revolutionizing the image and painting and allowing artists to create images in ways that no one had ever seen before. They understood the promise of the new technologies, the same technologies that their parents' generation didn't understand. And the older painters thought it was a lot of rubbish and some kind of cheap trick. So the Renaissance was about the meeting of art and science, and that's why it spoke to me so clearly, because that's been not only the path of my life, but the path that all of us have been on culturally, socially, politically over the past 100 years, since this electronic form has evolved since the telephone. Another concept of mine that was completely transformed during this period was the very notion of what a material object is. Now, I came from a generation that was anti-material. Vietnam era, late 1960s, social change, a mistrust of the economic system and the establishment. And so I didn't have much interest in material things. That's why I started video. And then, years later, one day, I was in my kitchen reaching up in the top cabinet for a bowl, and I pulled out a little green bowl which had a chip in it, which was why I put it way up in the top, because it wasn't useful anymore. I was searching up there and I found this bowl again. It was a bowl my mother had given me in Japan about 11 years earlier. And she had been dead for 1 year. And I pulled down this bowl and I held it in my hand, and I could feel her hand on the other side of this bowl touching it as she gave it to me when we were in Japan. And it was like a bridge through time. And I never had any feeling or awareness of what a material object can be in that sense before. I think that's why, for the professionals who work with art, the sense of touch is the most important. To touch the thing that someone touched, someone held 500, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 years ago. That's magic. That's a connection that you can't really describe in words. And I looked around me after that experience, and everything I saw, chairs, tables, cars, light bulbs, I realized they all were made by people, were invented by people. Everything was advanced technology at one time. The chairs you're sitting on were advanced technology at one time. And they are all objects of human desire. Desire to sit, desire to drink something, desire to move fast, desire to speak to your mother halfway around the world. All of these tools, these things come out of our hearts. And as objects, they all contain the essence, the thoughts and impulses of their maker. And this is a kind of, it's hard for us to think about this in the age of mass-produced objects. But even though mass-produced objects aren't handmade, conceptually, they contain the idea that gave birth to them. I remember seeing a show of prehistoric tools. There was an antler, and it had 2 marks in it. That's all. And you can imagine the archaeologist who discovered it. There's hundreds of antlers on the ground somewhere. You're digging them up, and only one has 2 marks. And once you see those 2 marks, that antler is absolutely, fundamentally different from all the other antlers that just fell off naturally. That has a human intention inscribed into it. Kira and I were in the Southwest, visiting the ruins of the Anasazi Indians, 1,000 years old. All these beautiful stone houses. You see them on the landscape from miles away, like small cities. And you walk up close to them finally, and you go right up to the walls, and between every stone in the mud, in the mortar, is pressed in the fingerprints of the people who made them. Hundreds, thousands of fingerprints in between the stones, sitting there. And I remember cleaning out my mother's things after she died and finding this $2 plastic hairbrush. And that $2 hair was more precious and more valuable and more expensive than any object I had ever touched with my hand. So that's why works of art in general are valued at a monetary amount much higher than the cost of the materials themselves. That's why art is expensive. And it's this secret life that's in them, our desire to touch eternity. And that's what drives the collectors, the curators, the conservators, the historians, and us, the public. That's what brings us to these things. So the last kind of preconception I had that was wiped away in all of this was the very notion of history, of a lineage and a tradition, which I thought when I was younger I was completely outside of. After all, I was an avant-garde artist. And that's what the avant-garde is, isn't it? It's breaking with tradition. Cut, no past, I'm free. That's the knowledge, the feeling you have when you say, I'm free from the past, I'm free from my past. Which of course is impossible. But we like to think it anyway. So there was no art history for me. It didn't matter, it wasn't relevant. Most of the work I saw wasn't really that useful. I had to know it so I could pass my art history class at university. It wasn't until Kira, my wife, and I went to Japan. We've been creative partners for many, many years, since 1977. She's right here somewhere. There she is. We went together to Japan, and a lot of things fell into place in that traditional culture. And one of them was the idea of the Japanese sense of the path that we take as artists, as individuals. And they call it michi, or do. And do means, the English translation for do is way, or the path. And I found myself in a culture which was describing for everyone, including contemporary artists, that you're connected to a path in your practice, no matter what you do. And that path doesn't stop with your birth. That path goes back to your teacher, your teacher's teachers, and all of the people lined up right back to the very beginning. I had never had that conception in my life before, that we all rest on the shoulders of the dead, that the presence of the dead is the most vital presence in our lives, the most dominant presence in our lives. And so even the notion of the avant-garde, which was hard for me to conceive of in this sense of tradition, even that fell away when I started studying the Japanese Zen artists, who, at the beginning of the 17th century, were thrown out of the court. They were the favored artists of the king, the shogun. Politics and the conditions changed. The new shogun didn't like Zen artists, kicked them all out, and large, professional, family-run studios, commercial art became popular, and the monks just had to leave. No more big money for big exhibitions, big projects. Now they're on their own. And they all went back to their temples, and they started to realize they had to rediscover and refocus their artistic practice. And in this new condition, they simplified techniques and materials, and they turned their art into a practice for themselves, not for mass media, but for their own lives in an individual way, a spiritual practice. And they made their work for a very small community. And that's exactly what happened in France when they broke with the Academy. So then I realized that even the avant-garde was a tradition, that there is throughout human history the tradition of breaking the rules. So, all of a sudden, I felt free for the first time. Free because of these connections, not because the lack of understanding or knowledge of them or the rejection of them, but because they existed. So now it felt to me at this point in my life, in my mid to late 30s, that I could go anywhere and do anything, that I was connected with all of these different traditions. And that art, in fact, became a part of human life, that it wasn't something that was separate from it, that the act of living was a creative act. And I came across an art historian by the name of Coomaraswamy. He's an art historian from Sri Lanka. It's one of my great influences. And he was already thinking in global terms at the turn of the last century, being a foreigner coming to the West, coming from a traditional culture. He was trying to understand the whole system. And Coomaraswamy took a look at our art museums and realized that, he said, the museums are the places we put the things we forgot how to use, which I love. Museums are where we put the things we forgot how to use. The other thing he said, which made a lot of sense to me at this point, was, despite the term visual art, all works of art represent invisible things. Despite the term visual art, all works of art represent invisible things. That was big. I couldn't get my mind around that at the beginning. And I thought about it a lot. Because in reality, what's in front of you at this moment, this present moment of our existence, is really the only thing we have. Many of the people you love and you're closest to are not here right now. Many of the things you care about, you're not touching right now. The words that I spoke to you 10 seconds ago don't exist anymore. The person you were when you came in this doorway is not the same exact person sitting in the seat that you're sitting in now, and will be different again tonight when you go home. And even photographs that we think hold time and capture time, in fact, they don't do that. The photograph holds light. But what happens is the time keeps changing. So therefore, you can look at an old photograph of your grandmother, and she's gone, and you show it to your kids, and they see people wearing funny clothes and driving funny cars that don't exist anymore. Why? Because the time keeps moving, keeps going. As Buddha said, one of his great realizations, all life is change. And the American psychologist Abraham Maslow was very brilliant. He said, this was about 40 years ago, he said this. He said, human consciousness is like a spotlight moving in a dark room. And everywhere it turns, it presumes that there is light. And that's one of the most beautiful descriptions of our sentient, conscious beings that I know. We exist, and therefore all of this exists around us. So it's the invisible things that really matter, in a way, in our lives and in our work. And I want to show you another video now. Can we start the video Memoria, please? And Memoria is a work that I made in 2000. And it has no sound, so I'll continue talking and we can watch it. It's a piece designed for a projection on a silk cloth. So it's a very, very fragile. And it was made with a old 25-year-old video camera, night vision camera. And it's very simple. So another way to describe this kind of essential presence that I'm talking about that exists in things is when we say that the possessions of people we know, especially ones who are gone, contain their memory. We call it a memory. And as a video maker who works with tape and DVDs and basically with recordings, with records, for me, memory is extremely important. Whether it's digital memory or biological, psychological human memory. And I think the most interesting thing about memory is that it is fundamentally non-visual. What is a memory? You know, right now, I can see the face of my mother very clearly. She passed away in 1991, 15 years ago. But that image that I see is nothing like the image that I see here in this light, or the image that I record with a camera, or what I see with my eyes when I walk down the street. So after thinking a lot about images and thinking about especially the images in our museums during this period of looking at art history, you know, I began to think, well, where do these images come from? And where is memory? What's an invisible image? And I looked at a little bit at the history of images in Western culture. And basically there's two kinds of images that were described going back to the late 6th century. Pope Gregory the Great described images as books for people who can't read. The books of the unlettered, he called it. And he was describing images that he used the term historia, images that tell stories, the lives of the saints, the lives of holy people, the acts of kings. And that was a kind of image he was interested in. And then in the late 8th century, in the Nicene Council, they described another kind of image, classified another kind of image. And that was an image they called imago, image in Latin. And it was an image for veneration and for devotion. And that was an image not of a story in time, but an image of a presence. And that's the images we see of the portraits of the saints in Western culture. They're very often standing, looking out at us, icons, very static, standing, looking out at us. And that's the other kind of image that exists outside of time. So you have one kind of image existing in time, and another one existing outside of time. And the imago image is the image of, that's the image I carry with me of my mother, the one that never changes, is eternal. And you can also say, of course, it can be a photograph too. I have photographs of her. And it's like the imago tradition of image making. Never changes. She always looks like she looked when she was young. St. Catherine always looks like a young woman in the painting. And then the idea, the last sort of idea that came up about images, notable ideas, was the idea of the image as a kind of remembrance, as a memoria, as a memory. And this was an aid to memory for the purposes of prayer. And the idea of remembrance is present in many major traditions, not just in Western tradition. And it's, in a personal level, a memory can transport us directly into the emotional realm of a great joy or a tragic sorrow. Instantaneously can come into your body. Memoria or memory is also one of the primary techniques of contemporary actors. That's how they practice their craft. Memory is extremely important for an actor today. And then I discovered, in my interest in other cultures, particularly non-Western cultures, that in the Islamic tradition, remembrance is extremely important. They call it dhikr, means remembrance of God. And if you look at the Islamic tradition and you understand the connection that they have to memory, to being in a constant state of knowing, they're reminded, there was a text I read which said that the function of the prophets is to remind, while the duty of human beings is simply to remember. And you can think of things today, of the Holocaust, of tragic events that have happened, the massacre of the Armenians by the Turks, all of these things in the world where people do not want to ever forget the preciousness that human beings have of holding on to memories is vital for our existence. A person without a memory is not a complete person. So we have one foot in the past and then at the same time putting one foot into the future, constantly. And the other thing I came across in my studies of the Islamic Sufi tradition was the idea that, and I was very interested in these kind of mystics and sages and people who were individuals, finding their own direct connection to God or to the depths of an idea or whatever you want to call this kind of intense mental focus. That they undertook that alone, on their own terms. They weren't being told by some authority figure what to do. And I connected with them very strongly as a contemporary artist, because it's the same with contemporary artists. You're not really in a group. We don't exist in big studios the way the Renaissance artists did. We go into our studio usually privately to work out the idea, to make the piece. And so I came across this quote: "The Sufi studies darkness in order to understand the light." And that gave me great inspiration to remember, if you ever get stuck doing your work, one of the standard techniques to use is to make yourself do the opposite. Don't even analyze it. Just do the opposite. If it's dark, make it light. If you're quiet, be loud. And you'll be amazed what happens at that point. And that's when I decided I wanted to turn out the lights to make video. I spent most of my life with the lights on because my camera needs a light. So I started to look for ways I could turn out the light and shoot an image that exists in darkness, which is a lot like the image that exists in here. So I moved into studying darkness, thinking about darkness. And I came across, again, in the Islamic tradition, actually the Persian tradition. We think of in the Western tradition, if you look at light and darkness, it's very, very specifically described by scientists. If you think of Isaac Newton described darkness as the absence of light. He described the color white as the highest color, as the sum total of all the colors together make white. And darkness is the absence of light, not color, the absence of light. Then I came across the Persian system of color, which is dispersed in the Islamic world. And I found in that system that black is a color, and not only is it a color, it's the highest color in the color chart. It's the highest color. And I thought, how could that be? Then I read some more, and I found out that in that system, black is actually a kind of material essence. It's a thing. And what it represents is, it's the color of the pupil of the eye, the window to the soul, the projection screen upon which all images are found. And then going deeper, black is the color of the closed eye, the darkness of the closed eye, the black of the closed eye, when it stands before God or before the maximum highest intensity of reality possible to perceive. And in that state of the most intense, highest intensity of reality, of aliveness, of being, the only possible way to withstand that intensity is to close the eye, to darkness. So black is actually the most sacred color. Now, guess what? This tradition came into Spain through this country's extraordinary, and I think very fortunate, connection to the Middle East in the southern part of Spain, historically. And I'm not a historian or anything, but I find it hard to believe that this idea of darkness that we find in people like St. John of the Cross, the Dark Knight, that could, to my mind, it had to come out of some contact or some vague thread or stream coming from these Middle Eastern cultures which understood darkness in this way. And if you look at the Spanish Baroque painters, the black that is in the paintings is probably the greatest, deepest black in the history of Western art. It's extraordinary. They were also trying to paint visions, trying to paint memories. They were trying to paint who I am, what I am, and what I am experiencing when you turn out the lights. That's an extraordinary artistic project. And St. John of the Cross is, for me, one of the greatest sources of inspiration I've had in my life. I made a piece about his life, his tragic life, which I think is showing right now at the Reina Sofia in the exhibition of video they have. It's called Room for St. John of the Cross. And of course, his connection to darkness is legendary. And he spoke of the idea of the via negativa, the negative way, the way of unknowing, the way of the closed eye, the way of the inner light, the black light that all the mystics describe. And I'll read you a few quotes of his. He says, "Human science is not capable of understanding it, nor experience of describing it. Only the one who has passed through it will know what it means, but there will be no words for it." Well, that's pretty extraordinary language for the 16th century in the context of Christianity. I sense Buddhist influences in St. John of the Cross. And running out of time here. Let me put on another video. Can we show the video Ascension, please? Just going to switch the video. There's a piece of mind that I created in 1999, I want to say, I think. It's called Ascension, and it directly comes out of the paintings of Zurbaran, especially the painting he did of Christ on the Cross, which is in the Art Institute of Chicago's collection, where I saw it. And it has the blackest black in a painting I've ever seen. And this painting was hung in a dark corner in the monastery of San Pablo el Real here in Seville. And the monks, when they came into the room and they saw this figure up in the dark corner, they refused to go in the room. So let's watch this. Okay, can we lower the sound a little bit, please, and I'll continue. We have very little time left, so I'm about halfway through of everything I wanted to say. It's okay. I'm an artist who works with time, so I tend to work a lot in slow motion, I guess. Okay, so let me go forward, fast forward through my lecture. So this idea of darkness, to just conclude, I think it's also not a coincidence today that in today's art, media art that I work in, you see a big change going on in the rooms of the museums. And you have a transition from the white box, the white walls, the light coming in the windows to see all these objects. And when you arrive in the media art galleries, the lights are turned off, the windows are blacked out, and it's dark inside. Why? Because the image in media art itself is a source of light. That image is luminous. If we turn on the lights in this room, that image disappears. So you have today, in terms of all the artists who are working with media, which seems to be more and more artists every year coming out of art schools who are interested in digital and media art, you have a whole group of artists today who are making works of art that you do not have to shine light on in order to see. And that might sound like an obvious or simple statement, but actually I think it's quite profound. I mean, everything we see is made possible by light bouncing off of it. All of these objects, material objects, by their nature are dark. They're solid, dark things. And you have to shine light on them to see. And now we have this other type of art, and it's related to things like stained glass windows and things like the use of candles in most sacred places around the world, the use of fire, which itself gives off light directly. And I think that's very much about this world of today we are in now, where so much of the things that we use and live with are fundamentally made up of invisible energies. And I think that is it's the same reason why we now describe a human body in terms of a code, the DNA code, which also itself is not a thing. It's not an object. It's a biological system which is, again, invisible and intangible. So, oh boy, I wish I had more time. But let me just finish with two things, a very short story, and then I want to show you one more video. So the story is, to conclude my own personal path that I've been describing in the course of this lecture. One of the big turning points for me in my life was when I was visiting the Art Institute of Chicago, where I saw the Zurbaran painting of Christ on the cross. And I was there to look at the galleries for an exhibition I was doing. And I arrived in the morning, and the person wasn't ready to see me yet, so I took a walk on my own through some of the historical galleries of older paintings. And I came into the gallery of early 15th century Northern European art, Flemish art. And at that time, 1999, my father was dying. My mother passed away in 1981. And at that time in 1999, my father was dying. And so I was very emotional, obviously, and not myself. And I walked into this room. It was first thing in the morning. It was empty, no people. I was alone. And there was a very small painting, about this big, on a wood panel by a Flemish artist named Gerrit Bouts. It's one of my favorite artists. And it was an image of a crying Madonna, a crying Mary. And the thing about it was painted in the Northern European Renaissance style, which at that time in the early 15th century was the most advanced image-making technique on the planet. They were using oil paint, which was brand new technique, new technology. Oil paint did not dry right away like tempera paint, which the Italians were using in the South. Oil paint stayed wet, and therefore you could continue to work it, to shade it for a few days. And furthermore, the consistency of the paint allowed you to use the tiniest brushes, so small that in a life-size image of a person, a portrait, you could see the reflection in the eye and the black of the pupil. You could see the reflection on every pearl in a woman's necklace, which is sort of the dream of the merchant class who was commissioning these images. But they had this extraordinary technique, and so this crying Madonna, you could see every tear coming out. You could see the tear again reflecting the light. And I was there alone, and I started crying, kind of uncontrollably. And as I explained earlier, I've had a few experiences of crying in museums, not very many. This one was very overwhelming. And for the first time in my life, I realized, thinking about it later after I recovered, why I was so emotional. Obviously it had to do with my father, but it also had to do with this image. Here's a woman crying in front of me. And of course, knowing a little bit about that, she's crying for me, she's crying for us. That's what the image in the Christian tradition is of Mary. The Buddhists call this same energy Avalokitesvara, which is the god of compassion. You find that in many Tibetan Buddhist monasteries. And in the Western tradition, Mary takes on this role. And these are eternal tears, they never stop. So I was completely overwhelmed, and later on thinking about it, I realized that, it was like a mirror or like feedback, that I was crying and the painting was crying. And for the first time in my life as an artist, I realized I was having an experience that had nothing to do with what my art professors taught me. That at that moment, I was using the artwork. I wasn't looking at it as a spectator. I wasn't analyzing it as a professional. I was using it. And at that moment, I felt like in my life, with all my experience of art, looking at art, for the first time in my life, it was as if I had spent my life looking at a computer in terms of looking at its keyboard, looking at its screen, looking at its processor as objects on a table without ever turning them on. I realized for the first time I turned on the computer and started using it. Never had that experience before. It was a sad one, obviously, but it was extremely enlightening and important. And that stayed with me. That moment, that line between professional and amateur, the line between art and life, disappeared forever. It's gone, and my experience right now is moved way beyond that. There is no boundary. And that was the last wall I had to break through. So let me finish with one more piece to show you. This one is, I think, to take this back again to a larger scale, like I started with, to think of all of us together on this earth at this time, all human beings being connected. We're made of the same stuff, the same material, the same essence. And I was asked in 1994 to make a piece for the Olympics in Athens. And I decided I wanted to make a piece about our contemporary lives and the fact that today most of us do not feel at home in the world. We don't feel safe. We don't feel trusting of other people. We feel our lives are out of control, that we are being subject to forces that are beyond our control, that we don't know, we can't see, we don't look anyone in the eyes, who can ruin our lives with violence, with economics, with politics. And so I think today people feel frightened, and they feel worried in this new global world empowered by media technology, which I use to make art, but which most of us use to conduct our lives and our business. And many, many acts of violence today are perpetrated through technology, through the computer. You push a button and you can wipe out a whole city. With this finger, one finger can eliminate 5 million people just with this muscle. That's the world we live in today. And so I made this piece. I want to show it to you. It's called The Raft. And I have to say that even though I feel today that it is the innocent who suffer the most, and it always has been in history, I still feel that no matter how bad things are, no matter how difficult our lives become because of the actions of our leaders or the actions of people who hate us, I always feel in the end, being a positive person, that human beings will survive. That no matter how bad it gets, human beings will make it through and continue to go on. So let me show you the raft as a closing to my lecture. Runs about 10 minutes. Can we look at the raft, please? I want to thank the Friends of the Museum again for inviting me to speak, and I want to also acknowledge our technical staff who are done an incredible job. It's a really good system that they have here today. And also my wife and partner Kira, who's here as I said, and Maria Remedios Tavernero, who's been our translator today. So thank you very, very much, and keep looking at art, okay? Bye. Thank you.